Welcome to the Silent Empires, where the stories speak softly, the nights feel endless, and every shadow seems to hold a secret of its own. This is a place for those who enjoy quiet storytelling, dark atmospheres, and the feeling of escaping into another world for a little while. No interruptions, no chaos, just uninterrupted stories carried through the silence. If this story drew you into its world tonight, take a moment to leave a like. And before the next story begins, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I always like seeing how many different people, from different corners of the world, are awake here together sharing the same moment. War came home to the American neighborhood in small, almost invisible ways. It was there in the locked metal gates over corner stores, in the way strangers checked their mirrors twice before turning down a quiet side street, in the hush that fell when certain names were spoken in a bar or barbershop. The newspapers told the story in stark black type: indictments, raids, plea deals, murders reduced to a few carefully chosen words. But the reality was more insidious, an atmosphere of low-level fear, of deals whispered in parking lots and cash changing hands in greasy envelopes. In that uneasy world, one name would surface again and again in court dockets, investigative files, and whispered conversations: Joseph DiPalermo. To some, he was just another neighborhood tough who rose too fast and fell too hard. To prosecutors, he was a dangerous operator knit tightly into the fabric of organized crime. To his family, he was a son who never quite escaped the gravitational pull of the streets that raised him. His story begins decades before the headlines, in a cramped apartment where the promise of the American dream collided every day with the reality of poverty, prejudice, and a city that offered as many traps as opportunities. He was born in the shadow of war and its aftermath, into an Italian-American world that still carried the memories of Ellis Island inspections and tenement hardships. The DiPalermo family, like thousands of others, had come over in waves, grandparents from Sicily and southern Italy, lured by the promise of steady work and a chance to leave behind rural poverty and rigid social hierarchies. By the time Joseph arrived, that first immigrant generation had already endured the Great Depression, the rationing of the Second World War, and the slow, uneven climb into the American working class. They lived in a neighborhood that felt like a transplanted village, Italian spoken in kitchens and on stoops, Catholic icons on the walls, Sunday dinners that stretched into the evening, and an intricate web of kinship and obligation where everyone knew everyone else's business. The street itself was a kind of classroom. Kids learned early who belonged and who did not. They watched as mothers leaned from second-floor windows to call children in for supper, as fathers trudged home from factory jobs with lunch pails, as older boys loitered on corners, smoking, trading stories about cars, girls, and the latest run-in with police. In such a place, a boy's prospects seemed to sort themselves quickly into two categories: those who could make it through school, into a union job or a civil service position, and those who drifted toward the informal economy that had long existed in the neighborhood's shadows. As the youngest son in a crowded household, Joseph absorbed this hierarchy without ever hearing it described. He saw uncles who had become small contractors or bar owners, proud of their tax bills as proof of legitimacy. And he saw others, sharp-dressed, always with cash on hand, whose income no one explained in polite company. His father represented the more traditional path. A factory man with thick hands and thinning hair, he believed in overtime hours, saving for a down payment, and keeping one's head down around authority. His mother ran the house with relentless energy, cooking, cleaning, stretching every dollar, insisting the children attend mass and respect their elders. Yet for all their effort, the family's hold on stability remained fragile. A layoff could wipe out months of careful budgeting. An unexpected medical bill or rent increase could plunge them into debt. As factories began to automate and then gradually relocate, men like Joseph's father felt the ground shifting under their feet. The old bargain, work hard and you'll be all right, no longer seemed guaranteed. The tension of that uncertainty infused the household. The quiet arguments over money behind closed doors, the worried lines on his mother's face as she wrote out checks at the kitchen table. Outside, the neighborhood was changing too. Post-war prosperity had drawn some families to the suburbs, leaving behind a population that was poorer and more tightly packed. New groups arrived, Puerto Rican, Black, and later other immigrant communities, bringing their own cultures and struggles. While some older residents adapted, others clung to a nostalgic version of the past and resented the competition for jobs and housing. This social friction overlapped with the long-standing undercurrent of organized crime that had taken root decades earlier. Local associations, clubs, and social halls served as fronts for gambling, loan sharking, and other illicit enterprises. Officially, they were places where men played cards and watched sports. Unofficially, they were nodes in a web of power that stretched far beyond a single block. Young boys like Joseph grew up acutely aware of that subterranean world, even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe it. They saw the difference in how certain men were treated. A neighborhood shopkeeper struggling with bills might suddenly find the money to renovate his storefront after a few late-night visits from a well-dressed visitor. A bar that had seemed on the brink of closing would reopen, brighter and busier, with unfamiliar faces tending the door. The police sometimes rolled slowly past these scenes, eyes averted. Adults might fall silent or change the subject when a certain name was mentioned, but their very evasiveness spoke volumes to a curious child. In school, Joseph was intelligent enough but easily distracted. The rigid structure of the classroom, with its bells, assigned seats, and rote lessons, clashed with the improvisational survival skills he was learning from the street. Teachers were overworked and often unfamiliar with the culture of the neighborhood. Some saw boys like him as trouble long before any serious misbehavior occurred. A few tried to intervene, offering encouragement or after-school help, but there were limits to what they could do against the pull of peer groups and economic reality. Truancy was common. Dropping out in the older grades was not unusual, especially for boys who could contribute to the family income with a part-time job or hustles that skirted the edges of legality. By his early teens, Joseph had begun to drift toward a circle of older boys who seemed to move with a different kind of confidence. They wore better clothes than their parents could likely afford, carried rolls of small bills, and could skip school without provoking much parental outrage because they often brought home cash. To outsiders, they were just another pack of local delinquents hanging around pool halls and candy stores. Within the neighborhood's unspoken hierarchy, however, they floated closer to the orbit of more serious men, drivers, lookouts, and errand runners for figures whose names rarely appeared in public, but were known to every precinct detective. This progression did not occur overnight, nor did it feel at the time like a moral descent. For a boy like Joseph, it seemed almost natural, a series of incremental choices that never felt decisive in the moment. Perhaps it began with running a message from one cafe to another for a small tip, or keeping an eye on a parked car while someone conducted business inside a building. Then came dice games in alleys, small stakes at first, then more serious sums. He discovered that he had a certain knack for reading people, for sensing when someone was bluffing or desperate. That talent attracted the attention of older players, some of whom saw in him a useful tool, bright, discreet, and eager to earn. Meanwhile, the official institutions of authority, schools, churches, the police, struggled to hold their influence. The parish priest might deliver sermons about personal responsibility and the dangers of easy money, yet everyone knew parish funds sometimes depended on donations from successful businessmen whose ledgers, if examined too closely, would have raised uncomfortable questions. The local precinct might crack down on petty vandalism, while more sophisticated operations remained untouched. Children noticed these contradictions. For Joseph, They contributed to an early and growing skepticism about the fairness of the system he was being asked to respect. Family life offered both anchor and friction. His parents, aware that the neighborhood could swallow a boy whole, tried to monitor his movements, but work schedules and fatigue made constant vigilance impossible. Arguments over curfews, school attendance, and questionable friends became more frequent as he entered his mid-teens. His father might respond with harsh words or even a slap, but such disciplinary measures often backfired, driving the boy further toward peers who claimed to understand him better than any adult ever could. His mother, torn between love and fear, oscillated between pleading for him to change course and quietly slipping him small amounts of money, hoping that if he did not have to hustle so hard, he might avoid serious trouble. The broader context of the era intensified these familial and neighborhood tensions. Across the country, urban centers were experiencing rising crime rates, social unrest, and a breakdown of older communal structures. Television brought new images of wealth and success into homes that still smelled of factory grease and laundry soap. The gap between what young people saw and what they could realistically achieve through conventional means seemed to widen. For someone like Joseph, who already had one foot in the informal economy, the attractions of its faster, if riskier, rewards were hard to resist. Law enforcement in cities with entrenched organized crime faced its own contradictions. On one hand, political leaders and police commissioners publicly vowed to tackle syndicates and clean up neighborhoods. On the other, decades of corruption, underfunding, and sheer institutional inertia limited their effectiveness. Investigations into mob-connected activities often moved slowly, hampered by a code of silence among potential witnesses, and by the careful insulation of high-ranking figures from direct involvement in street-level offenses. Patrol officers might arrest a group of teenagers for a fight or a small-time theft, but the more consequential activities, gambling systems, loan sharking networks, protection arrangements, required specialized units, long-term surveillance, and the cooperation of prosecutors and judges. For much of Joseph's early life, these larger battles played out above his head, even as their outcomes shaped the contours of his neighborhood reality. In this environment, small brushes with the law became almost a rite of passage for many local boys. A night in a precinct holding cell for disorderly conduct, a summons for underage drinking, a lecture from a weary desk sergeant. These episodes did not yet mark someone as a hardened criminal. They were seen, rather, as tests of toughness and loyalty. Did the boy complain? Did he give up names? How did he behave when questioned? Such incidents offered older, more serious operators a glimpse of whether a youngster might be reliable enough for more sensitive tasks. By his late teens, Joseph had accumulated a handful of such encounters, none serious enough to result in extended detention, but enough to put his name in local files and to harden his own sense that he and the authorities were on opposite teams. Despite this, there were still moments when his life might have taken a different turn. A teacher who recognized his sharp mind tried to get him interested in a vocational program that could lead to steady work in a trade. A cousin who had joined the military wrote letters describing the possibility of travel, training, and a clean break from the constraints of the neighborhood. For a few months, he toyed with the idea of enlisting or of apprenticing in a legitimate business. But each time, the gravity of his existing relationships and the immediate lure of cash pulled him back. Legitimate options often required short-term sacrifice, unpaid training, lower initial wages, in exchange for long-term stability. The underworld economy, by contrast, dangled quicker money and the intoxicating respect that came with being able to pay for rounds at the bar or help a struggling relative with rent. As he moved into adulthood, the line between youthful mischief and more structured involvement began to blur. The same skills that had served him in card games and small hustles, an ability to read risk, to project confidence, to negotiate under pressure, were now being noticed by men who operated at a higher level. They didn't recruit him with speeches or oaths. Instead, opportunities appeared. A chance to keep an eye on a warehouse late at night, to accompany someone on a trip to collect a debt, to stand near a door and signal if anyone suspicious approached. Each task was modest enough to feel manageable. Each came with more money than he could earn in an honest week's work, and each incrementally deepened his entanglement. Within his family, a kind of uneasy accommodation emerged. They might not know the specifics of his activities, but they knew enough to worry. At the same time, the extra money he brought in made certain things possible: a newer refrigerator, help with a medical bill, a small family vacation they had never before been able to afford. This material improvement dulled some of their protests, even as it sharpened the fear that they were, however indirectly, benefiting from conduct that could someday bring disaster. Gossip circulated among relatives, an aunt whispering that he was running with the wrong crowd, an uncle defending him as just a kid trying to get ahead. Such disputes reflected a deeper ambivalence in the community itself, which relied on underground economies even as it publicly condemned them. The city's physical landscape testified to the enduring power of the world Joseph was entering. Certain restaurants always seemed busy, their back rooms reserved for private meetings at odd hours. A particular social club, with its opaque windows and buzzing door, hosted a steady flow of well-dressed men whose cars lined the curb outside. These were not secrets. They were open facts of neighborhood life. Residents adjusted their routines accordingly, crossing the street to avoid being caught in the middle of someone else's business, instructing their children never to repeat certain things outside the family. In this milieu, the abnormal became normalized. A teenager watching such scenes could easily conclude that the most effective power structures in his environment operated outside the bounds of official law. The national mood around crime and punishment was also shifting during these formative years. High-profile hearings, investigative journalism, and televised exposés began to pull organized crime further into public consciousness. Politicians campaigned on promises to crack down on syndicates that, in theory, resembled those connected to Joseph's world. Federal agencies expanded their investigative tools, developing new strategies for infiltration and surveillance. Wiretaps, informant networks, and coordinated task forces slowly altered the balance of power. But for a young man at street level, these developments felt distant and abstract. What he saw day to day was that certain people continued to operate with apparent impunity, while others, often poorer, less connected, bore the brunt of police attention. All of these forces, family dynamics, neighborhood culture, economic pressure, and evolving law enforcement tactics, converged to shape Joseph DiPalermo's early trajectory. He did not wake up one morning and decide to become a notorious figure. Instead, he followed a path that had been worn over decades by men before him, a path that seemed, in his immediate surroundings, less exotic than the idea of college or a corporate career. It offered a familiar logic. Loyalty was rewarded, weakness was punished, and authority was something to be evaded or manipulated rather than trusted. By the time his name began to appear more regularly in the notebooks of detectives and the internal reports of prosecutors, much of his worldview had already been formed. Those who would later investigate and prosecute him would spend countless hours reconstructing these years, interviewing childhood acquaintances, combing through old-school records, re-examining minor arrests that, at the time, had seemed inconsequential. Their aim was to understand how a boy from a working-class family evolved into an individual repeatedly linked to serious criminal activity. The answers they found were not simple and did not absolve him of responsibility. But they did reveal a context in which personal choice intertwined with structural forces, where ambition collided with limited opportunity, and where the boundaries between survival and exploitation were dangerously thin. It was within this charged, unstable environment that the adult Joseph DiPalermo would emerge, carrying with him the habits, loyalties, and resentments forged in those early, formative years. a combination that would soon bring him to the attention of law enforcement in a far more serious and enduring way. By the time Joseph reached his early 20s, the neighborhood had begun to regard him less as a kid underfoot and more as a figure with a certain standing. He was not yet at the center of anything major. No one in serious circles would have trusted him with that level of responsibility, but he had moved beyond petty hustles. The men who had watched him grow up now evaluated him with a different eye. Was he dependable? Did he keep his mouth shut? Would he panic if something went wrong? These quiet assessments were rarely voiced, but they shaped the kinds of opportunities that came his way. The opportunities were always presented as favors, not jobs. A man would mention that he had to straighten something out with someone who was late on a payment and might ask Joseph to come along just to stand there. Another might need him to drive a car to a nearby city, no questions asked, with the assurance that everything inside was legit enough. Payment came in folded bills, sometimes more than his father's weekly take-home pay from the factory. The amounts were not extravagant by any absolute measure, but for a young man accustomed to counting singles, they were transformative. He could dress better, carry himself differently, and contribute more openly to household expenses, a fact that did not escape his parents' notice, even if they chose not to dwell on its source. At the same time, his name was beginning to show up more often in police paperwork. Early references were scattered. A field interview after officers broke up a dice game in an alley, a brief notation about his presence at a bar raided for after-hours drinking, a mention in a report about a stolen car found abandoned near his usual hangout. None of these incidents was enough to justify formal charges, but together they formed a pattern. Detectives who specialized in tracking organized crime kept mental and physical files of such names, aware that the foot soldiers of larger networks often began as precisely the sort of neighborhood tough Joseph was becoming. Law enforcement attention, however, remained diffuse. The city's police department was stretched thin by rising crime rates, budget constraints, and political interference. Patrol officers focused on responding to immediate calls, assaults, burglaries, domestic disputes. Vice squads pursued visible targets, street-level gambling, brothels, illegal numbers operations. Organized crime units, where they existed, had to prioritize cases that would justify the investment of long-term surveillance and undercover work. A young man like Joseph operated mostly in the spaces between these priorities, too connected to ignore completely, but not yet central enough to justify a dedicated investigation. Within his own milieu, that intermediate status had its own logic. The men above him understood that exposure carried risk. They preferred to insulate themselves by relying on people whose faces were not yet known to every detective assigned to organized crime. That meant using younger associates, men like Joseph, to handle tasks that might draw police attention but were still, in their view, manageable. Collections, deliveries, quiet warnings, and the orchestration of low-level gambling games fell into this category. When something went wrong, it was usually these intermediaries who dealt with the immediate consequences, giving the higher-ups time and distance to protect themselves. Joseph did not enter this role blindly. By now, he had seen enough of his environment to recognize the potential costs. He knew older neighborhood figures who had done stints in prison, emerging thinner, harder, and more guarded. He also knew of others who had not returned at all, men whose names were spoken in lowered tones, followed by a shrug and the phrase, he knew what he was into. Yet the risks could feel abstract, especially in the absence of a tangible alternative. The traditional routes to advancement, union apprenticeships, civil service exams, entry-level positions in legitimate businesses, either required credentials he did not have or connections he lacked outside his insular world. Economic conditions made the calculus harsher. As manufacturing jobs declined and the cost of living rose, young men without higher education watched the baseline of stability recede. Official unemployment figures captured only part of the picture. Underemployment and precarious work were equally corrosive. The cash economy operating beneath the surface of the neighborhood, by contrast, seemed stubbornly resilient. People always wanted to gamble. Small businesses under pressure always needed quick loans. Those who feared reporting threats or vandalism to police often preferred to pay for protection. Each of these needs represented a revenue stream for networks that, in turn, relied on men like Joseph to keep the machinery running smoothly. His first serious formal encounter with the legal system came in this period, an incident that would later be revisited by prosecutors trying to trace his ascent. It began with something seemingly routine, the collection of a debt from a local bar owner who had fallen behind on payments to people whose patience was not limitless. Joseph went along with an older associate to remind the man of his obligations. Accounts of what happened next vary, depending on whether one reads police reports, court documents, or the later recollections of those present. What is clear is that the conversation escalated. Words were exchanged. The bar owner made some remark that was interpreted as disrespectful, and the encounter became physical. When the dust settled, no one had suffered catastrophic injury, but there was enough damage, both to property and to people, to draw police attention. A neighbor called in the disturbance. Officers arrived, took statements, and made arrests. For the first time, Joseph found himself booked on charges that carried the possibility of real jail time. Assault, intimidation, and related counts tied to the allegation that he had participated in an attempt to force payment through threats and violence. The case would not, in the end, result in a long sentence, but it marked a turning point. His name moved from the periphery of police files to a more central position in the minds of those tracking the neighborhood's criminal ecosystem. The subsequent legal process exposed him to a different side of the underworld, its relationship with lawyers, bondsmen, and the often intricate dance with the courts. From the moment of his arrest, he was not alone. Within hours, word had spread through the neighborhood networks. A bondsman appeared at the station. An attorney with experience in handling such cases introduced himself, explaining that he had been sent by someone whose name required no elaboration. Joseph's family, shaken but relieved that he would not languish in a cell pending trial, watched as a world they barely understood mobilized to protect one of its own. The lawyer's strategy reflected a practiced understanding of the system. He emphasized Joseph's lack of prior serious convictions, framed the incident as a barroom dispute that had gotten out of hand, and cast doubt on the bar owner's credibility by highlighting his financial troubles and prior disputes with other creditors. Behind the scenes, quiet pressure was exerted through informal channels. Witnesses were reminded by intermediaries of the general wisdom in not getting involved beyond the bare minimum. The bar owner, weighing the risks of pushing the case aggressively against the potential consequences for his business and personal safety, found his resolve softening. Ultimately, the charges were reduced as part of a plea agreement. Joseph admitted to a lesser offense that resulted in probation, a fine, and a stern lecture from the judge about wasting your life in the gutter when you could still straighten out. On paper, it looked like a relatively minor legal setback, the sort of early brush with the law that many offenders experience before either desisting or escalating. In practice, it hardened his position within the informal hierarchy of his world. He had taken the weight without trying to implicate others. He had endured the stress of arrest and arraignment without crumbling. In the eyes of older figures, this proved something about his character, something they valued. From that point forward, his participation in more structured activities increased. Gambling played a significant role. Illegal card games, sports betting operations, and numbers rackets had long been staples of organized crime revenue, and they relied on a chain of personnel: organizers, collectors, enforcers, and, at the lowest levels, runners who ferried slips and cash between locations. Joseph, with his experience in street-level games and his growing reputation for reliability, became more deeply involved in managing such flows. He graduated from player to organizer in some local games, overseeing who could sit, how credit was extended, and how disputes were resolved. This shift brought him into more frequent contact with the men who controlled these operations at a higher level. They tended not to advertise their authority, preferring modest public personas: the owner of a small business, the operator of a social club, the quiet man in the corner booth of a restaurant who always seemed to be reading a newspaper. To outsiders, their lives might have appeared unremarkable. Within their circles, however, they wielded considerable influence, arbitrating disputes, allocating territories, and deciding who could earn in which domain. Being in their orbit was a mark of advancement, but it also raised the stakes of any misstep. The money at this stage was better, but it came with new forms of pressure. Gambling operations required constant maintenance of relationships with bettors, with small business owners who allowed back rooms to be used for games, with lower-level police who might look the other way in exchange for favors or who, at minimum, could be counted on not to prioritize enforcement in certain locations. Negotiating these relationships demanded social skills as much as toughness. Joseph was learning that violence or intimidation, while tools in the arsenal, were not always the most effective or profitable options. Keeping a valuable bettor happy could mean extending credit, forgiving a portion of a debt to preserve the longer-term relationship, or smoothing over an insult that, in another context, might have prompted a more forceful response. At home, the contradictions of his life sharpened. Outwardly, he remained the same son and brother, attending family gatherings, visiting aging relatives, occasionally showing up at Mass on major holidays to keep up appearances. Yet his hours were increasingly irregular, his phone calls more frequent and private, his absences harder to explain. His parents, by now, understood that whatever line he had once walked between minor mischief and serious involvement had been crossed. Conversations became tense. His father, still tethered to the belief that honest, if difficult, work was the only secure path, tried again to steer him toward legitimate employment. They argued, sometimes bitterly, about respectability, risk, and loyalty. Those around them interpreted this family drama in different ways. Some relatives quietly sided with the father, seeing Joseph's path as a betrayal of the sacrifices earlier generations had made to establish a foothold in America. Others, more resigned or more entangled in similar networks themselves, took a softer view, framing his choices as an adaptation to harsh realities. The generational divide was stark. Older family members carried memories of open prejudice, of signs that had once read, "No Italians need apply," and associated climbing into the mainstream economy with dignity and safety. Younger men, facing a labor market that no longer rewarded their limited formal education in the same way, saw fewer avenues to replicate that climb. Law enforcement's perspective on Joseph was evolving in parallel. What had once been scattered mentions of his name in routine reports were now supplemented by more focused attention. Detectives who monitored gambling in the area began to note him as someone who consistently appeared around certain operations. Intelligence units compared notes with colleagues in neighboring precincts, mapping out the web of relationships among various figures. When a bar was raided for illegal betting slips, Joseph's presence, even if he managed to avoid arrest, was recorded. If a neighborhood bookmaker was picked up and questioned, the names he refused to speak, as much as those he did, offered investigators hints about the structure of the local network. During this period, government at both the local and federal levels intensified its emphasis on combating organized crime. High-profile commissions and task forces produced reports detailing the scope of racketeering in major cities. New statutes expanded the tools available to prosecutors, allowing them to pursue not only individual acts, but patterns of conduct associated with criminal enterprises. However, translating broad policy shifts into effective action on the street remained challenging. Building cases against mid-level figures like Joseph required evidence that could survive in court. Corroborated testimony, financial records, surveillance that captured more than vague associations. The code of silence that governed Joseph's world complicated such efforts. Those who participated in illegal activities together understood that cooperation with authorities was the ultimate betrayal. Stories of rats who had suffered severe consequences circulated as cautionary tales. Whether all such stories were accurate was beside the point. Their function was to discourage anyone from seeing the legal system as an alternate path when pressure mounted. For many years, this code held firm. Witnesses were scarce, and those who might have provided valuable information often weighed their own safety and the unwritten rules of the neighborhood more heavily than any abstract obligation to the law. Still, cracks were beginning to form in that culture of silence, and Joseph's generation would eventually be affected. Economic stress, generational turnover within crime families, and the intensifying tactics of law enforcement all contributed to a gradual increase in cooperation from some quarters. Informants, once rare in certain domains, became more frequent, sometimes motivated by self-preservation, sometimes by resentment, sometimes by financial incentives offered by investigators. Joseph, in these early years of his deeper involvement, remained largely unaware of the specific individuals who had begun to talk in other cases, but he could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. More caution around phones, more care in choosing meeting places, more frequent reminders from older men about what should and should not be discussed in public. Even as the climate grew more cautious, his reputation within his own realm solidified. People who owed money knew that a visit from him meant the grace period was over. Yet accounts from those who dealt with him during this phase suggest that he often preferred to resolve matters through negotiation when possible. He could be firm, even threatening, but he also understood that a debtor kept earning was more valuable than a debtor driven into flight or permanent destitution. This pragmatic approach earned him grudging respect from some local business owners who, while resenting their dependence on unregulated lenders, nevertheless found him more predictable than some of the more volatile enforcers they had encountered. This managerial side of his activity did not lessen its illegality or the harm it caused. High interest rates, backed by the implicit threat of consequences for non-payment, trapped many borrowers in cycles of dependency. The money they diverted to service such debts came at the expense of investments in their businesses or households. Yet the same economic and social conditions that had nudged Joseph toward his role also pushed some of these borrowers into the arms of the very system that would later be cited as predatory. Banks were often unwilling to extend credit to individuals with poor or non-existent formal records. Those operating marginal businesses in struggling neighborhoods found conventional loans out of reach. In this vacuum, underground lenders flourished. As his 30s approached, Joseph stood at a precarious middle point. To law enforcement, he was no longer a peripheral figure but not yet a marquee target. To his associates, he was an earner who could be trusted with sensitive tasks, but still ultimately subordinate to men whose names rarely appeared in print. To his family, he was both a source of pride, strong, street-smart, capable, and of deep anxiety, a son whose path seemed increasingly likely to end in either prison or worse. He moved through these overlapping worlds with a practiced ease, compartmentalizing as much as possible. A holiday dinner here, a backroom meeting there, a night at a local bar where he could be simultaneously visible enough to maintain his standing and careful enough not to attract the wrong kind of attention. In hindsight, investigators and historians studying his life would identify this era as a crucial pivot. It was in these years that his patterns of association, methods of operation, and relationship to both law and community became fully elaborated. The trajectory he followed from here, toward higher-profile conflicts with authorities, more significant legal battles, and a growing public reputation as a notorious figure, did not arise out of thin air. It was the logical extension of habits, decisions, and circumstances that had been set in motion long before, in the alleys and storefronts of a neighborhood where the line between survival and exploitation, between community and coercion, between opportunity and entrapment, was drawn in constantly shifting, often invisible ink. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the quiet pattern that had defined Joseph DiPalermo's criminal life began to collide with a new reality. Authorities at every level were learning how to turn the diffuse awareness of organized crime into targeted, methodical pressure. The world that had once allowed him to operate with relative impunity was tightening. Those who had grown up believing that keeping one's mouth shut and avoiding paper trails was enough suddenly faced tools, tactics, and legal frameworks designed precisely to overcome those old protections. The most consequential of these developments from Joseph's perspective was the increasing use of long-term investigations built around wiretaps, surveillance, and the cultivation of cooperating witnesses. For years, he and others in his orbit had relied on simple precautions, meeting in person, avoiding explicit language on phones, using intermediaries to pass sensitive messages. These habits were not abandoned, but their adequacy diminished. Federal agents, often working in task forces with local detectives, obtained court orders to listen in on phones registered to social clubs, small businesses, and even residences associated with suspected figures. They planted microphones in bars and back rooms where men felt most at ease. They watched patterns of movement, cataloging who met whom, how often, and under what circumstances. Joseph did not immediately grasp the extent to which this new scrutiny was reshaping his risk landscape. What he and many others noticed first were the effects rather than the mechanisms. More coordinated raids on gambling operations that had long been tolerated, sudden indictments that described, in unnerving detail, conversations and meetings that had taken place months before, men who had seemed unshakable agreeing to plea deals that included cooperation with the government. News of these developments traveled fast through his world, discussed in coded terms in cafes and on street corners. Each new arrest or indictment prompted speculation. Who had talked? Who was wired up? Which previously safe locations were now compromised? Against this backdrop, his own operations had grown more lucrative and more exposed. Sports betting, in particular, had become a major component of his activity. Advances in communication, more television coverage of games, faster reporting of scores, and later, the spread of electronic data networks, made it easier to run large-scale betting operations across neighborhoods and, in some cases, across state lines. Joseph occupied a mid-level position in this ecosystem. He coordinated local bookmakers, who took bets from individual gamblers, and passed along aggregated wagers and receipts to higher-level organizers who balanced exposure and handled large outlays. The money involved was considerable for someone of his background. Weekly betting handles in his territory could reach into the tens of thousands of dollars during peak sports seasons. His cut, though a fraction of the total, surpassed what many legitimate small business owners in the same neighborhood earned in the same period. With that income came visible signs of success: better clothes, a newer car, the ability to pick up checks at restaurants without flinching. For a man raised in a household where every expense was scrutinized, this visible command of cash reinforced his sense that he had chosen a path that, whatever its risks, delivered on its promises. Yet these very trappings made him more noticeable, not only to those within his community, but to law enforcement and journalists beginning to map the personalities behind local rackets. Police reports from this period, later cited in court and in press coverage, frequently described a well-dressed Italian male, believed to be DiPalermo, arriving at or departing from locations under surveillance. Agents noted his routines: the club where he often began his evenings, the diner where he liked to meet before Sunday games, the side streets he used to avoid main thoroughfares when moving between spots known to host betting action. Even as surveillance intensified, the day-to-day mechanics of his role required a degree of openness. Bettors had to know where to find him or his people. Bookmakers needed face-to-face contact to settle accounts, particularly in an era when electronic transfers were not yet common in underground economies. Payments from gambling were often interwoven with those from other activities, such as high-interest loans, creating a network of financial relationships that investigators could, with enough time and resources, begin to trace. Bank deposits made by bar owners or small shopkeepers flagged as consistent associates drew attention. Even large cash purchases, when noticed by financial institutions wary of money laundering regulations, sometimes generated reports that eventually landed on the desks of agents already curious about DiPalermo. Within his own camp, there were efforts to adapt. Older figures reminded younger associates to be cautious, to vary their routines, to avoid carrying ledgers or anything that could be seized and used as tangible evidence. They discouraged written records, favoring memory and simple, disposable slips that could be destroyed quickly. But not everyone had the same capacity for recall, and operations of increasing complexity strained even the sharpest minds. In some gambling rings that boasted hundreds of regular bettors, it became nearly impossible to function efficiently without some form of record keeping. When law enforcement managed to seize those records, during raids on apartments, clubs, or cars, it gave them a rare, concrete glimpse into the scale and structure of Joseph's activities. The first major case that brought him squarely into the sights of prosecutors emerged from such a combination of old-fashioned policing and newer investigative tools. Over the course of many months, a joint task force monitored several gambling locations in his neighborhood and neighboring districts. Undercover officers placed bets with low-level bookmakers linked to his network. Parallel to this on-the-ground work, agents secured wiretap warrants on phones associated with certain social clubs and private numbers believed to be used by key figures. The resulting recordings, though often couched in coded language, began to reveal recurring patterns, references to tickets and action, to making the line right, and to settling up after particularly heavy weekends. Investigators cross-referenced these calls with surveillance logs that documented Joseph's movements. When phone conversations suggested a meeting to reconcile accounts, officers noted that his car often appeared near the designated location. When voices on the line discussed "our friend Joey" or JD, agents listening, already predisposed to interpret such nicknames as references to him, added further notes to his file. These inferences were not always airtight. Names could be common, nicknames reused. But in law enforcement strategy, patterns and context often carried as much weight as any single piece of evidence. Eventually, the task force and prosecutors felt they had enough to justify a coordinated strike. Early one morning, teams fanned out across several neighborhoods, executing search warrants at homes, businesses, and clubs connected to the network they believed managed a substantial local slice of the illegal sports betting market. Doors were knocked, or in some cases forced open. Filing cabinets, cash drawers, and hidden compartments were combed for betting slips, cash, ledgers, and anything that would corroborate the narrative investigators had constructed from months of observation and listening. Joseph was among those taken into custody that day. The arrest, unlike his earlier brushes with the law, came with a sense of weight and finality. He was no longer a young man facing a barroom assault charge that could be pled down. The charges outlined in the initial complaint were more serious and more complex, promoting gambling, conspiracy, and crucially, allegations that his activities were part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Although not yet framed under the most sweeping federal racketeering statutes, the language reflected a growing prosecutorial tendency to see individuals like him not as isolated offenders, but as integral parts of structured organizations. The experience of being processed this time differed from his earlier encounters. The questioning was more pointed, the agents more prepared. They knew details of his routines, the names of people he had assumed were obscure to outsiders, the approximate scale of money changing hands in operations linked to him. They asked not only about specific incidents but about relationships, who gave whom instructions, who reported to whom, who took the largest share of profits. Their goal was not merely to secure a conviction against Joseph himself, but to pressure him in the hope that he might, in turn, provide information about those above him. He refused to cooperate. His answers, where he gave them, were brief and denied any organized structure beyond guys who like to bet on games. His lawyer, quickly summoned once again from the short list of attorneys familiar with such cases, instructed him to say as little as possible. Bail was set higher this time, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations, but the same networks that had supported him before mobilized again. Money was raised. Promises were made to family members that were going to take care of this. He was released pending trial, but the period that followed was marked by a different tone, both in his personal life and in the wider community. For his family, the arrest represented the realization of long-held fears. They had lived for years with the anxiety that his activities might one day lead to a prolonged separation, through imprisonment, harm from rivals, or worse. Seeing him associated by name and photograph in press coverage of the crackdown, described as a key figure in a gambling syndicate, gave concrete form to what had previously been a more diffuse dread. Relatives reacted variously, some with anger, others with resigned sorrow, a few with muted defensiveness when confronted by neighbors or coworkers who had read the stories. Within the neighborhood, reactions were complex. Some locals, long accustomed to the presence of illegal gambling, regarded the raids as an overreaction by authorities more interested in headlines than in the day-to-day concerns of residents. To them, the betting operations were a familiar, if technically illegal, part of the local economy, a way to add excitement to sports and for the house to generate income in a context where legitimate business opportunities were limited. Others, particularly those who had seen loved ones fall into debt or worse as a result of compulsive gambling, welcomed the crackdown as a necessary check on exploitative practices that had gone unaddressed for too long. From the standpoint of law enforcement, the case held symbolic value beyond the specific charges. It demonstrated their ability to penetrate networks long perceived as insular and resistant to outside scrutiny. Press releases emphasized the months of careful investigation, the cooperation between agencies, and the broader message that no one is above the law. In court filings, prosecutors portrayed Joseph and his co-defendants as participants in a system that siphoned money from vulnerable communities, undermined public trust, and in some instances, served as a gateway to more serious forms of organized criminality. The legal process that followed was lengthy and contested. Defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of certain wiretap evidence, questioned the sufficiency of probable cause in the issuance of search warrants, and argued that prosecutors were unfairly inflating the importance of what were, in their view, relatively routine betting operations. They painted Joseph as, at worst, a facilitator of consensual activities among adults who chose to gamble, not as a violent or predatory figure. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence tying him to any broader syndicate, insisting that repeated association with known figures did not, in itself, constitute proof of hierarchy or conspiracy. Prosecutors countered by highlighting patterns. They presented seized records showing consistent flows of money through channels that matched the movements documented by surveillance. They played selected recordings in which, according to their interpretations, coded language clearly indicated discussions of odds, payouts, and risk management. They called law enforcement experts to the stand to explain how such gambling networks typically operated, using that generalized knowledge to frame the specific activities attributed to Joseph. In doing so, they attempted to lift the case from the level of isolated acts into the realm of organized, sustained criminal enterprise. While the courtroom arguments unfolded, Joseph's daily existence narrowed. The conditions of his release restricted his movements. He had to check in regularly, avoid contact with certain individuals already under indictment, and stay clear of any activity that could be construed as related to gambling or other illegal enterprise. Compliance was both a legal necessity and a challenge to his identity. For years, his status in his community had been tied to his role as someone who could make things happen, arrange bets, settle disputes, provide access to quick cash. Now, even if he had been inclined to resume those activities openly, the risk of additional charges for violating bail conditions loomed. This enforced pause, however partial, offered a moment of potential reflection. Some men in his position, faced with the reality of the legal consequences and the strain on family and finances, chose to step back, to seek out legitimate work, to recalibrate their lives. In Joseph's case, the sense of obligation and loyalty he felt toward his network, combined with a deep skepticism about the fairness of the system prosecuting him, made such a pivot difficult. To walk away would not only risk alienating those who had posted bail and covered legal fees, it would, in his view, represent a betrayal of the unwritten rules that had governed his adult life. Even as the trial loomed, he seemed to many observers determined to ride out the storm rather than seek a fundamental change of course. The verdict, when it finally came, reflected both the strength and the limits of the state's case. He was convicted on some counts related to promoting gambling and conspiracy, acquitted or spared conviction on the more sweeping allegations that prosecutors had hoped would set a precedent for treating such mid-level operators as part of a formally recognized criminal enterprise under newer laws. The sentence imposed included a period of incarceration, though not the maximum allowable under the statutes, followed by supervised release and financial penalties. To the prosecution, it was a meaningful step in asserting control over a slice of the city's illegal economy. To Joseph and those close to him, it marked the moment when the abstract risk that had long accompanied his work hardened into concrete loss of freedom. In the years to come, analysts and historians would point to this case as the moment he transitioned, in the public record, from a largely anonymous neighborhood figure to a name associated in court documents and media coverage with organized crime. The label notorious, when it eventually attached itself to him, did not arise solely from the severity of his conduct, but from the fact that his activities, background, and conflicts with law enforcement came to embody a particular narrative. The rise of an underworld operator shaped by post-war urban change, confronted by a legal system straining to adapt to new forms of criminal organization. The prison term he began after sentencing would not be his last encounter with state custody, but it marked the first extended period in which the rhythms of his life were dictated not by street codes and informal obligations, but by the regimented routines of an institution designed to contain the very world from which he had emerged. Prison stripped away the small illusions that had sustained Joseph DiPalermo on the street. The doors clanged shut with an authority that no neighborhood figure could overrule, and for the first time since his teenage years, the contours of his days were dictated by someone else's schedule, counts, meals, work assignments, lights out. He arrived not as an anonymous inmate, but as a man already tagged in intake paperwork as tied to organized crime, to gambling, to a web of relationships that corrections officials were instructed to monitor. In many institutions by this time, authorities had learned from hard experience that letting men affiliated with the same criminal networks cluster unchecked could mean ceding entire wings to their control. Intake officers reviewed his file carefully. The gambling case, the references to suspected associates, the notes from prosecutors about his perceived role in a broader gambling structure. Though he was not among the highest priority figures, he was marked as someone to watch. Housing decisions reflected that caution. He was placed in a unit where officials believed they could limit his access to certain other inmates, while still keeping him under the ordinary routines, rather than the strictest regimes reserved for those considered especially dangerous or disruptive. Inside, criminal hierarchies adapted rather than disappeared. Men from various backgrounds and affiliations tried to carve out their zones of influence, regulating contraband, settling disputes, and in some cases, recreating on a smaller, more compressed scale the power structures of their home neighborhoods. Joseph's reputation followed him in on the voices of inmates who had read about his case in the papers, or who knew people he had dealt with on the outside. He was neither the dominant force nor a nonentity. To some, he was the gambling guy. To others, simply another Italian from a city whose underworld lore had produced many such figures. The early weeks were a shock even for someone accustomed to the threat of violence. The constant noise, the surveillance, the enforced proximity to men with whom he had nothing in common beyond their status as offenders created a pressure cooker environment. Fights broke out over trivialities, line cutting in the mess hall, a perceived slight in the yard. Guards intervened when they could, but many altercations flared and cooled within the informal order maintained by inmate groups. Joseph, guided by instinct and years of street experience, kept his head down initially, watching more than talking, assessing which alliances mattered here and which postures were merely theatrical. In this compressed society, his skills in reading people and situations remained valuable. He learned which officers were rigid rule followers and which allowed small favors, extra time on the phone, a slightly delayed cell lockdown, to inmates who didn't cause headaches. Among prisoners, he gravitated toward those who, like him, were tied to organized structures rather than impulsive, volatile crimes. These men understood long games, favors banked, grudges carried, information traded carefully. Conversation in the yard often turned to cases, lawyers, judges, who was fair, who was rumored to be owned, who handed down sentences that felt disproportionate. While some inmates turned prison into an extension of their criminal activities, running contraband, orchestrating scams by phone, Joseph's options were constrained by the scrutiny his file attracted. Authorities monitored his communications more closely than those of a generic low-level offender. His visitors were vetted. Phone calls were recorded and sometimes flagged for review by investigators still interested in what he might reveal, inadvertently or otherwise, about structures and figures beyond his own case. This awareness shaped how he spoke, both to family and to those few associates who came to see him. He avoided names, spoke in abstractions, steered conversations away from anything that might be construed as operational. The separation from his neighborhood, however, did not sever his ties to the world that had defined his adult life. Letters from the outside brought news: who had been arrested, who was rumored to be cooperating, which businesses had closed, which young men were stepping up to fill gaps created by the recent gambling crackdown. Each piece of information fed into his mental map of shifting loyalties and emerging risks. He also heard, sometimes indirectly, about the effects his absence had on his immediate circle. Some local bookmakers who had once answered to him were now under different supervision. Families who had relied on him for loans or favors had to seek help elsewhere, sometimes on harsher terms. For his own family, visits to the prison became a painful ritual. The trip often required long drives, hours spent in waiting areas, and subjecting themselves to searches and procedures that underscored their son's status in the eyes of the state. His mother tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy during these visits, updates on relatives, talk of holidays and milestones, but the environment made every exchange heavy. His father, who had once yelled at him in their kitchen about the dangers of the life he'd chosen, now spoke more softly, the unspoken acknowledgement between them that the argument had been decided by forces neither could fully control. During these years, the criminal justice system itself was shifting. Legislatures, responding to public concern about crime, passed statutes mandating harsher penalties for repeat offenders and expanding the scope of laws aimed at criminal enterprises. Federal racketeering statutes, once applied sparingly and mostly to headline-grabbing cases, began to appear more often in indictments against a broader array of defendants. Prosecutors were encouraged to think in terms of patterns, enterprises, and conspiracies rather than isolated acts. From his vantage point inside, Joseph could feel this change indirectly. Men came in with longer sentences for conduct that, a decade earlier, might have drawn lesser sanctions. Talk in the yard reflected a growing fear that they're throwing the book at us now. This broader punitive turn shaped how authorities thought about him even after his gambling sentence. While his prison term for that case was finite, the label attached to him, organized crime figure, repeat offender, participant in conspiracies, would shadow every future encounter with law enforcement and the courts. Correctional caseworkers, parole boards, and later, probation officers read his file with that frame in mind. It influenced decisions about his work assignments, his eligibility for certain programs, and, crucially, how seriously any disciplinary infraction inside was treated. Despite the hardening of official attitudes, there were also pockets within the institution that encouraged some measure of rehabilitation. Educational programs offered inmates the chance to earn equivalency diplomas, take basic vocational training, or participate in group discussions about decision-making and responsibility. These programs, often underfunded and oversubscribed, reflected a competing current in criminal justice thinking. The idea that offering offenders tools to change their trajectories could, in the long run, improve both their lives and public safety. Some men embraced these opportunities wholeheartedly, others dismissed them as irrelevant or cosmetic. Accounts from staff who later spoke about his time inside suggest that Joseph's participation in such programs was selective. He attended what he had to for good time credits, but remained skeptical of any initiative that he perceived as requiring confession or contrition beyond what he was prepared to acknowledge. He maintained to himself and to those he trusted that his gambling activities, while illegal, were part of a continuum of behaviors tacitly tolerated for years in neighborhoods like his, suddenly recast as urgent threats only when political winds shifted. This attitude did not endear him to counselors who hoped for clearer expressions of remorse, but it resonated with other inmates who shared his sense of being targeted more for who they were and who they knew than for the specific harms of their conduct. Time in prison did, however, force a measure of introspection. Removed from the constant demands of maintaining operations, he had hours, days, to replay decisions, to remember warnings he had ignored, to consider alternate paths he might have taken. The letters he received from his cousin in the military, the vocational brochures a teacher had once pressed into his hand, the job offers he had shrugged off because the pay seemed insulting compared to his earnings on the street, all of these resurfaced in the long stretches between counts. Whether this reflection softened his stance or merely reinforced his belief that the system had offered him little of real value is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but those who saw him around this time noticed some changes. A greater protectiveness toward younger inmates from his neighborhood, a tendency to caution them, quietly, without sermonizing, about diving too quickly into roles that would mark them in the same way he had been marked. Eventually, the clock on his sentence ran down. Parole boards, reviewing his case, weighed the seriousness of his offense, his institutional record, and the risk he supposedly posed if released. Their deliberations were not only about him as an individual, but about the message his release or continued confinement would send. Organized crime cases carried symbolic weight. No official wanted to appear lenient in a climate where elected leaders spoke often of getting tough. Still, he had avoided major disciplinary trouble inside, completed required programs, and maintained family support. After serving the term the law demanded, augmented or reduced by whatever good time calculations applied, he stepped back through the gates into a world that had not stood still in his absence. The neighborhood he returned to was both familiar and altered. Some of the old social clubs remained, their facades a little more worn, their regulars a little older. A few establishments had closed, their windows now dark or replaced by new businesses catering to a different demographic. Younger families had moved in from other backgrounds, changing the language heard on the streets. Some of the men who had been fixtures on corners when he left were gone, dead, incarcerated, or retired into quieter, less visible lives. A new crop of up-and-comers, many of whom had been teenagers when he went away, now occupied spaces he had once claimed, running games, collecting debts, fielding quiet requests from residents who needed help that official channels would not or could not provide. For Joseph, re-entry posed concrete challenges that went beyond re-establishing status. The terms of his release came with conditions. He was to avoid association with known felons, abstain from engaging in gambling, and maintain legitimate employment. Compliance was monitored by a parole or probation officer tasked with balancing enforcement with support. On paper, these conditions were standard. In practice, they were difficult to reconcile with the only adult life he had known. Nearly all of his close associates were, by definition, known felons. Most of the legitimate employers willing to hire someone with his record offered low-paying, physically demanding jobs with little security. He made gestures toward compliance. For a time, he worked through connections to land short-term positions, helping on construction sites, doing maintenance for a relative's business, assisting in a warehouse. The paychecks were a stark contrast to the rolls of cash he had once counted out in back rooms, but they provided at least a partial answer when his supervising officer asked how he was supporting himself. Family members and friends also stepped in to ease his transition, offering small loans, meals, and a place at the table during social gatherings where he could feel briefly like something other than a subject in a case file. Yet the gravitational pull of his old world remained strong. Bar owners and small shopkeepers, hearing that he was back, reached out, not always to draw him into new schemes, but sometimes simply to ask advice, to reminisce, to inquire about unresolved matters from before his incarceration. Old debts, old grudges, old favors still lingered in the community's collective memory. Some saw his return as an opportunity to settle accounts. Others viewed it as a chance to reestablish a sense of order that, in their eyes, had frayed in his absence. These interactions put him in dangerous territory. Even a conversation on a sidewalk could, if observed by the wrong eyes, be interpreted as a violation of his release conditions. Law enforcement, for its part, did not treat his release as the end of the story. Detectives updated their files to reflect his return. Federal agents, mindful of the long-term nature of organized crime investigations, noted that a man with his experience and connections was now back in circulation. Some wondered whether his time inside had made him more cautious or, conversely, more hardened and determined. They watched for signs that he was resuming his previous role in gambling or branching into other activities common in the underworld portfolios of the time. Loan sharking, extortion, the manipulation of union locals, or schemes to skim from cash-heavy businesses. In public records from these years, Joseph's name begins to appear in a wider range of contexts. Beyond the surveillance notes and sporadic mentions in police reports, there are references in investigative journalism pieces that sought to trace the persistence of racketeering in cities supposedly cleaned up by earlier crackdowns. Reporters talked to anonymous sources, bar owners, former associates, even some law enforcement officers off the record, who described him as emblematic of a certain kind of underworld survivor. Not a flamboyant boss, but a durable operator who adapted to pressure and remained embedded in the everyday life of his neighborhood. These portrayals, while not always precise in their details, contributed to the slow construction of his public reputation. Whereas earlier generations of organized crime figures had operated largely in the shadows, invisible to anyone not directly affected by their activities. Joseph's era coincided with a media environment more interested in nomming and narrating such lives. Television segments, magazine features, and later book chapters bundled his story with others to illustrate broader themes. The endurance of illegal gambling even as state lotteries expanded, the ways in which loan sharking preyed on cash-strapped small businesses, the challenges faced by law enforcement in distinguishing between rumor and verifiable fact in tightly knit communities. For his family, this emerging public profile had mixed effects. On one hand, it brought a sense of violation. Aspects of their private pain were now fodder for readers and viewers. Old photographs, school records, and anecdotal recollections from distant relatives or former neighbors sometimes surfaced in ways that felt intrusive. On the other hand, the attention underscored the reality that whatever they thought of his choices or the fairness of his treatment, Joseph's life had become entangled with forces beyond the personal. He was no longer just their son, brother, or cousin. He was, in the eyes of the state and segments of the public, a symbol in debates about crime, punishment, and the limits of social mobility. The crucial question during this phase of his life was whether his prison term and the conditions of his release would mark a turning point, a gradual disengagement from the underworld, or merely an interlude before deeper re-engagement. The historical record suggests the latter. Economic necessity, ingrained identity, and the structural barriers facing a man with his record and skills combined to push him back toward familiar patterns. He moved carefully, more aware than before of the investigative tools at authorities' disposal, but he did not abandon the networks that had both sustained and endangered him. As the late 20th century pressed on, the social and legal environment around organized crime continued to evolve. New laws allowed assets suspected of being tied to illegal activities to be seized, even absent a criminal conviction, adding financial stakes to every move someone like Joseph might make. Informant programs grew more sophisticated, offering relocation and protection to those willing to testify. Surveillance technologies improved, shrinking the spaces in which underworld figures could assume privacy. Amid these shifting sands, he continued to navigate, drawing on the lessons of his early life, the scars of his incarceration, and the complex loyalties that bound him to a world increasingly in confrontation with the full apparatus of modern law enforcement. In the years following his release, the pattern of Joseph DiPalermo's life settled into a tense equilibrium. On the surface, he observed the requirements imposed by his parole and later by the terms of his supervised release. He kept appointments with his supervising officer, produced pay stubs from short-term jobs, and submitted to the occasional unannounced visit. To a casual observer, he might have looked like any other ex-offender trying, with mixed success, to find his place in a city that had changed while he was away. Beneath that surface, however, his old networks were slowly knitting him back into a familiar web. The gambling economy in his neighborhood, temporarily disrupted by the raids and prosecutions that had sent him to prison, had not disappeared. It had adapted. Some operations had become smaller and more dispersed, relying on a greater number of lower-level bookmakers to reduce the risk that any single raid could cripple the entire structure. Others had begun to experiment with new technologies, pagers, later brick-sized mobile phones, to coordinate bets without requiring as many public meetings. For someone with Joseph's experience and reputation, this landscape offered both opportunity and danger. He knew the rhythms of sports seasons, the psychology of bettors, the ways to manage risk and credit. Men who had been junior figures when he went away now ran their own books, but many still deferred to his judgment in matters of odds, volume, and how far to extend credit to particular customers. He did not need to sit in smoky back rooms with a ledger in front of him to influence the flow of money. Advice given at a cafe table or whispered at the back of a bar could shape decisions that rippled outward through the network. Law enforcement, sensitive to this possibility, treated him as a continuing person of interest. Surveillance teams rotated through his neighborhood, sometimes following him from home to job sites, from family gatherings to late-night stops at familiar haunts. They noted the cars he entered, the faces he greeted, the length of his visits. Informal logs described him chatting with bar owners known to have hosted illegal betting in the past, lingering on sidewalks where numbers runners had once circulated, exchanging nods with figures whose names were already underlined in investigative files. At the same time, investigators faced the perennial challenge of distinguishing between association and culpability. A man like Joseph, rooted in a tight-knit ethnic community, could hardly avoid seeing people with criminal records if he simply walked down the block to buy a newspaper. Family ties further complicated the picture. Cousins, in-laws, childhood friends who had chosen similar paths or who, at minimum, were known to the police, were part of his social world. Supervision officers could warn him to stay away from known felons, but the application of such a rule in practice was fraught. Judges and hearing officers reviewing alleged violations often had to decide whether a conversation on a sidewalk or a shared coffee in a public place constituted a genuine breach of conditions or merely the unavoidable consequence of geography and history. Gambling was not the only activity in flux. The loan sharking trade, informal, high-interest lending to individuals and small businesses shut out of traditional credit, remained a steady, if shadowed, income source for organized networks. Economic shifts had left many neighborhood entrepreneurs vulnerable, bars struggling with new competition and changing demographics, small shops squeezed by rising rents and the advance of larger chains, families reeling from job losses in declining industries. Banks tightened lending standards, and new financial products marketed to poor and working-class communities, payday loans, check-cashing services, often proved as costly as the underground alternatives. In this space, figures like Joseph could once again find relevance. Evidence compiled later by investigators and presented in various legal and administrative settings placed him increasingly close to the world of informal lending. Bar owners and shopkeepers who fell behind on rent or faced emergency expenses were introduced, sometimes by mutual acquaintances, to people who could help. The terms were rarely written down but widely understood. Quick cash in exchange for high weekly or monthly payments, with the implicit understanding that default would invite persistent, escalating pressure. While it is not always clear from the surviving documents which specific loans he personally arranged, and which he merely influenced, his name appears in multiple accounts as someone present at key conversations, someone whose presence signaled that a casual request had become a more serious obligation. Those on the receiving end of such loans described a complicated relationship. Some later told investigators that they felt trapped and exploited, watching as interest payments drained their already precarious finances. Others offered a more ambivalent view, acknowledging that the money had kept them afloat during crises when banks would not even let them through the door. In both cases, the moral calculus of Joseph's role was not simple. He operated in a space where formal systems had failed many of his neighbors, yet the solutions he and his associates provided carried their own, often severe, costs. As these underground economies churned, the legal environment around them grew harsher. In the late 20th century, prosecutors at the federal and state levels increasingly turned to enterprise-focused statutes to tackle the persistent presence of organized crime in American cities. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, moved from a seldom-used tool to a central pillar of high-profile cases. Under RICO and similar state laws, prosecutors did not need to prove a defendant's direct involvement in every specific act of gambling, extortion, or loan sharking. Instead, they sought to show participation in an ongoing enterprise, engaged in a pattern of such acts. For investigators already accustomed to tracking Joseph's movements and associations, this shift in strategy was significant. His value as a target no longer depended exclusively on catching him in the act of taking a bet or collecting a debt. If they could demonstrate, through surveillance, financial records, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses, that he played a role in directing, organizing, or facilitating the enterprise, that could be enough. Long-running investigations took on a new flavor. Agents and detectives looked for patterns across years. The same faces appearing at different clubs, the same names recurring in the books of illicit lenders, the same phone numbers connecting gamblers, bar owners, and suspected enforcers. The turning point in this phase came when several individuals in his extended network decided to cooperate with law enforcement. Motivations varied. Some faced their own serious charges and hoped to reduce exposure. Others, weary of years of intimidation or tired of the constant grind of debt payments and fear, saw in cooperation a way out. Once they agreed to talk, investigators spent hours taking detailed statements, cross-checking claims against existing information, and, where possible, securing documentary or electronic corroboration. In these interviews, Joseph's name appeared often. Cooperators described him as a mediator in disputes among gamblers, as a man who represented certain higher-ranking figures in local matters, as someone who handled collections that had moved beyond gentle reminders. One business owner, in a statement that would later be summarized in affidavits, recounted how late payments on a loan had led to a visit from Joseph and another man. The account was careful, avoiding lurid detail, but conveyed the essential points. The conversation emphasized consequences, the tone was serious, and the implication was clear that continued non-payment was not an option. Such testimony on its own would not necessarily have guaranteed a conviction. Defense attorneys in organized crime cases are skilled at undermining the credibility of cooperators, highlighting their self-interest, inconsistencies in their statements, and any deals made with the government. But combined with surveillance logs, phone records, and seized documents from prior raids, these voices helped prosecutors piece together a more complete picture of the network in which Joseph operated. They could show patterns of contact between him and known bookmakers or lenders right before or after key events. They could point to coinciding spikes in bank deposits at certain businesses and meetings he attended. They could trace, in a necessarily incomplete but suggestive way, the flow of money and influence. It was against this cumulative backdrop that a new wave of legal action began to coalesce. Task forces, drawing on local, state, and federal resources, built case files thick enough to support the next step. A comprehensive indictment targeting not just isolated incidents of gambling or usury, but a group of individuals alleged to be part of a criminal enterprise that had, over many years, profited from illegal betting, extortionate loans, and related conduct. The draft language of this indictment, refined over months of internal review, presented Joseph not as a fringe participant but as a key operative, a man who, while not at the apex of the hierarchy, played a vital role in bridging top-level decision-makers and street-level enforcers. When the indictment was finally unsealed, it landed with more force than the earlier gambling case that had first sent him to prison. The charges were broader, the potential penalties more severe, the public messaging by authorities more emphatic. Press conferences featured charts and diagrams showing the alleged structure of the enterprise, boxes and lines connecting names, with Joseph's positioned prominently among those labeled as management or supervisors. Prosecutors spoke of taking down a long-standing criminal organization, of liberating local businesses from the stranglehold of illegal debt and gambling, of sending a message that no level of the hierarchy is immune from accountability. For Joseph, the arrest felt both sudden and long anticipated. He had lived for years under the awareness that he was being watched, that friends and acquaintances had gone into interrogation rooms and courtrooms from which they emerged changed, that whispers circulated about who was talking. Yet the moment of actual arrest, the knock at the door in the early morning, the presence of federal agents alongside local detectives, the reading of charges steeped in dense legal language, brought the reality into sharp relief. This was not a simple violation of parole or a single gambling bust. It was a confrontation with a legal apparatus that had spent years preparing to deal with men like him. The immediate legal response followed a script honed in prior cases. He was taken to a federal facility, processed, and presented before a magistrate judge. Prosecutors argued that his history, the seriousness of the charges, and his alleged continued involvement in criminal activity made him a risk if released. Defense counsel, often the same or from the same tight circle of attorneys who had represented him before, countered by pointing to his family ties, the fact that he had previously surrendered to face charges, and the presumption of innocence. Bail, if granted at all, would be high and accompanied by strict conditions. At this juncture, the pressures on him multiplied. Prosecutors, aware that mid-level figures could provide valuable information about higher-ups, made overtures through his lawyer about possible cooperation. They framed it in pragmatic terms. With the evidence arrayed, his chances at trial were uncertain. Sentencing guidelines under racketeering statutes were unforgiving. Cooperation could significantly reduce his exposure. To sweeten the offer, they pointed to others in similar positions who had chosen to testify and received relatively lighter sentences or entry into witness protection programs. But cooperation carried its own costs. In his world, turning state's evidence was more than a legal maneuver. It was a fundamental betrayal that severed one from the social fabric of the community and the moral code of the underworld. Those who cooperated faced not only the fear of retaliation, but the nagging knowledge that, in their old neighborhoods, their names would be invoked as examples of disloyalty. Joseph had grown up absorbing stories of stand-up guys who did their time in silence and of rats whose fates, whether embellished or not, were held up as cautionary tales. The historical record suggests that, consistent with the patterns of his life, he refused to cooperate. His attorney signaled to prosecutors that he was prepared to fight the case rather than testify against others. This decision hardened the path ahead. It meant that legal strategy would focus on challenging the government's characterization of his role and undermining the credibility and coherence of the enterprise narrative. The defense would argue that what prosecutors painted as a structured organization was, in reality, a loose collection of individuals engaged in overlapping but independent hustles. They would assert that relationships were misinterpreted, that the same handful of names turning up in various contexts reflected the smallness of the neighborhood, not the existence of a coherent, hierarchical criminal entity. As pretrial motions unfolded, battle lines sharpened. Defense teams filed challenges to the admissibility of certain wiretap evidence, contending that affidavits used to secure warrants overstated or misrepresented the significance of vague conversations. They questioned the reliability of cooperators, digging into their backgrounds to find inconsistencies, prior lies, and incentives to curry favor with the government. Prosecutors responded with their own filings, defending the integrity of their investigations and emphasizing corroboration. Where a cooperator's story matched phone records, surveillance logs, or seized documents, they argued, it became more than mere hearsay. Throughout this process, Joseph's life contracted once again to the narrow corridors of detention centers and the ritual of legal consultations. Family visits resumed, this time in county and federal facilities rather than state prisons. His parents were older now, his mother's hair more gray, his father's steps slower. Siblings and cousins who came to see him juggled their own responsibilities with the emotional strain of supporting a man whose choices had, once again, brought him into conflict with a system that showed little inclination toward leniency. In the neighborhood, news of the racketeering indictment reverberated. Some locals, jaded by years of similar headlines, shrugged it off as more of the same. Another round in a seemingly endless contest between law enforcement and an underworld that adapted as fast as it was attacked. Others, especially those who had been touched directly by the enterprise, through debts, threats, or the loss of loved ones to addiction and compulsion, saw the case as a long overdue attempt to confront structures that had held sway too long. Media coverage, often relying on law enforcement narratives and limited interviews, portrayed the defendants as part of a fading era's last gasp, the remnants of a once dominant organized crime model now squeezed by both legal pressure and broader economic and social change. Whatever the broader interpretations, for Joseph the case represented the culmination of trajectories set in motion decades earlier. His early immersion in neighborhood street life, his progression through gambling and informal enforcement, the first major gambling conviction and prison term, his re-entry and gradual re-entanglement in the same networks, all these strands converged in the racketeering indictment. The legal and social conflicts that had defined his reputation were now crystallized in a single, sprawling case file that sought to tell a coherent story about who he was and what he had done. As he awaited trial, the weight of that story pressed in from all sides. Prosecutors framed him as a linchpin of a predatory enterprise. Defense attorneys insisted he was being scapegoated as part of an overbroad crusade. Family members oscillated between anger at his refusal to leave the life behind and a fierce, if battered, loyalty to the man they knew before he became the subject of legal narratives and news features. In the small routines of detention, meal lines, recreation periods, the scratch of pen on legal pads as he reviewed documents with his lawyer, he inhabited the quiet center of a conflict that would, in the next phase of his life, spill fully into the open arena of a high-stakes trial. The trial that followed the racketeering indictment against Joseph DiPalermo unfolded as a kind of public reckoning, not only with his individual conduct, but with the place of organized crime in the late 20th century American city. It took shape in a federal courtroom lined with wood paneling and guarded doors, a space designed to impose order on stories that, outside its walls, were tangled with fear, loyalty, and the quiet compromises of neighborhood life. From the first day of jury selection, it was clear that the case carried more weight than the usual docket of narcotics and fraud charges. Prospective jurors were questioned closely about what they had seen in the press, whether they had opinions about organized crime, and if they believed that law enforcement and prosecutors might sometimes exaggerate in such cases. The judge, aware of the history surrounding racketeering trials in major cities, pressed them on whether they could evaluate testimony from cooperating witnesses who themselves had committed crimes. It was an attempt to construct a panel capable of listening to weeks or months of dense, sometimes technical evidence without being swept away either by sensationalism or by reflexive skepticism. Joseph sat with the other defendants in neatly pressed clothes, hair combed back, trying to project calm. To anyone who had grown up in his neighborhood, his face would have been a familiar one, older now, but still bearing the same sharp eyes that had watched card games and collections decades earlier. To the jurors, most of whom had no personal connection to the world being described, he was a figure largely defined by what lawyers would say about him. The government saw in him a hardened operator. The defense would urge them to see a man whose life had been misinterpreted through the lens of investigators eager to build a big case. When opening statements began, the prosecution laid out its narrative in broad strokes. They described a criminal enterprise embedded in local bars, social clubs, and small businesses. They spoke of illegal gambling operations that moved hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, of loans issued at punishing rates, and of a climate in which non-payment could not be treated as a simple business matter. Without resorting to graphic detail, they emphasized the climate of intimidation that allowed such an enterprise to function. The way a visit from certain men, a phone call at the right time, or a word dropped in front of family members could convey the seriousness of a debt. Within that structure, they positioned Joseph as an important middle manager. He did not, they conceded, occupy the top rung of leadership. There were others, some indicted, some not, who they believed made broader strategic decisions. But they argued it was men like him who translated those decisions into everyday actions, who visited delinquent borrowers, brokered disputes among gamblers, and made sure money flowed upward in predictable patterns. Charts and timelines were projected for the jury, showing his name recurring in connection with specific bars, bookmakers, and lenders over a span of years. The defense's opening took a different path. They did not deny that illegal gambling and informal lending had taken place in the neighborhood. You don't need the federal government to tell you there's betting on football in any big city, one attorney remarked. But they challenged the leap from scattered, loosely organized wrongdoing to the existence of a structured, ongoing enterprise in the legal sense. They portrayed Joseph as a man who had certainly made mistakes, who had already served time for past gambling offenses, but who was now being swept into a net cast too widely in an effort to produce a dramatic victory against organized crime. They urged jurors to be cautious about testimony from cooperators, reminding them that such witnesses had strong incentives to please the government. The government's case-in-chief unfolded methodically. Agents and detectives took the stand to explain the mechanics of their investigation, the surveillance that logged Joseph's presence at certain locations, the wiretaps that captured coded conversations, the seizure of betting slips and ledgers from raids stretching back years. Jurors heard transcripts of calls in which voices discussed taking care of accounts, keeping pressure on debtors, and not letting guys think they can walk away. The language was opaque, full of euphemism and shorthand. Prosecutors relied on the testimony of experienced officers to interpret it, arguing that in context, these were clearly discussions of illegal gambling and loan collections. Defense attorneys pushed back hard in cross-examination. They asked agents whether any of the calls explicitly mentioned physical harm or overt threats. Often, the answer was no. They inquired whether the voices on the tapes had been conclusively identified as Joseph's or someone else's, and whether any mistakes were possible in matching those voices to specific people. They highlighted occasions when surveillance teams had seen him enter or leave a bar or club, but had no direct evidence of what he had done while inside. Time and again, they tried to peel away the layers of inference, suggesting that the government was reading more into ambiguous behavior and language than the evidence strictly supported. If the law enforcement witnesses laid out the skeleton of the government's case, the cooperators provided its flesh. One by one, men who had once worked within the same shadowed economy took the stand under their own plea agreements. Some had been bookmakers who moved bets through networks that, they said, ultimately answered to the enterprise described in the indictment. Others had borrowed money with heavy terms and later faced pressure to pay. A few had participated in collections, accompanying more senior figures, including, at times, Joseph, to remind debtors that obligations were not optional. Their testimony was delivered under obvious strain. Many had families still living in the same neighborhoods. All knew that their cooperation would mark them permanently in worlds where loyalty was prized and betrayal despised. Under questioning by prosecutors, they described meetings in back rooms, cash exchanged in envelopes, instructions given and followed. They spoke of Joseph stepping in to mediate when a bettor fell behind, or when two local bookmakers argued over who had the right to a particular customer. None testified to explicit enjoyment of these roles. Instead, they cast their own participation as part of a system in which saying no had felt dangerous. Then came cross-examination, and with it the defense's opportunity to undermine these accounts. Attorneys walked cooperators through their criminal histories, prior convictions, uncharged acts they had admitted in proffer sessions, lies told to authorities before deciding to cooperate. They pressed them on the benefits they hoped to receive: reduced sentences, relocation assistance, sometimes monetary support. "You're not here out of some sudden moral awakening," one lawyer suggested to a witness. "You're here because it's in your interest, isn't that right?" The witnesses, anticipating such attacks, acknowledged their incentives but insisted that they were telling the truth as best they could. Joseph's name arose repeatedly. One cooperator testified that if a bookmaker in their area had a problem, they were told to talk to him. Another recalled accompanying him on visits to business owners behind on payments. Yet even in these accounts, there were limits. When asked directly whether he had ever seen Joseph physically injure someone, a key witness said no. When questioned about whether Joseph had ever explicitly threatened a specific act of violence, several said that much was often left unstated. The implication, based on reputation and prior stories, was considered enough. The prosecution used this to argue that he understood and deliberately exploited the climate of fear that allowed the enterprise to function. The defense countered that this was precisely the sort of vague, atmospherically charged testimony that should make jurors cautious. At no point did the trial dwell on graphic detail. Judges in such cases, mindful of both legal standards and evolving media guidelines, typically limit unnecessarily lurid descriptions, focusing instead on conduct relevant to the specific charges. What emerged instead was a picture of pressure applied via presence, reputation, and controlled escalation. A late-night knock on a debtor's door, a conversation conducted in front of employees or family, a suggestion that "guys are starting to talk about you." Each of these, in the prosecution's telling, formed part of an implicit language of coercion that did not need explicit threats to be understood. Joseph himself did not take the stand. This was not unusual in serious criminal trials. Defendants often choose, with their lawyers, to rely on the presumption of innocence and the burden on the government rather than open themselves to cross-examination. But his silence allowed prosecutors, in closing arguments, to suggest that the detailed accounts of cooperators were unrefuted by an alternative, specific narrative from him. Defense attorneys objected to any implication that he bore a duty to testify, and the judge carefully instructed the jury that they could not hold his silence against him. Still, in the human calculus of a jury room, the absence of his voice as a direct counterweight to the government's portrayal may have carried an intangible cost. The legal arguments in closing crystallized the competing frames. For the prosecution, the case was about pattern and context. No single phone call or meeting might, on its own, prove his role, but taken together, the evidence formed a coherent picture. A man whose consistent presence at key junctures, whose relationships with both higher-ups and street-level operatives, and whose involvement in money flows demonstrated participation in a criminal enterprise. They reminded jurors that racketeering law did not require proof of personal involvement in every predicate act, only knowing and intentional participation in the affairs of the enterprise. The defense urged the jury to resist the lure of a tidy story. They argued that prosecutors had stitched together everyday elements of neighborhood life, men from the same background socializing at the same bars, relatives and old friends crossing paths, and through the testimony of cooperators seeking leniency, transformed them into evidence of a grand conspiracy. They emphasized the absence of clear, unambiguous proof tying Joseph to specific acts of extortion as defined by law. "You must decide," one attorney told the jurors, "whether the government has proven what it claims, or whether it has merely taken a name it associates with a certain world and draped it in speculation." After weeks of testimony and argument, the case went to the jury. Deliberations stretched over several days. From the outside, those hours were opaque. Only occasional notes sent to the judge, requests for read-backs of testimony, clarifications of legal instructions, offered glimpses into their debate. At one point, they asked to hear again the judge's explanation of what constituted participation in the conduct of an enterprise's affairs. Under racketeering law, a signal that they were grappling with the core legal theory rather than accepting it at face value. When the jurors finally returned to the courtroom, faces drawn from the strain of their task, everyone present understood that the next minutes would set the direction of the rest of Joseph's life. The clerk read the verdicts count by count. In some instances, where the evidence was thin or the cooperator's testimony less corroborated, the jury acquitted. On other counts, particularly those related to promoting illegal gambling and participating in a pattern of racketeering activity, they found him guilty. The enterprise, in the eyes of this particular jury, had been proven to exist, and he was deemed one of its knowing participants. The mixed verdict reflected both the strengths and the limits of the government's case. Prosecutors had not succeeded in convicting every defendant on every count, and some of the most sweeping allegations fell short of the unanimous agreement required. But the convictions they did secure against Joseph and several co-defendants were significant. They carried the possibility of long sentences under guidelines that treated racketeering differently from isolated offenses. For law enforcement agencies and prosecutors who had devoted years to piecing together the case, the outcome was greeted as a major, if partial, victory. Sentencing, held months later after pre-sentence reports and legal submissions, was its own somber ritual. The court was required to consider various factors: the seriousness of the offense, the need to deter others, the history and characteristics of the defendant, and the advisory sentencing guidelines. The prosecution argued for a substantial term, pointing to his prior gambling conviction, his decision not to abandon the life after serving that earlier sentence, and the cumulative harm they attributed to the enterprise's activities. Defense counsel urged the judge to consider his age, his family responsibilities, and the fact that he had not been personally linked to the most severe allegations that had circulated in the broader investigation. Joseph was given an opportunity to speak. Those who were present recall that he did not offer grand declarations. He acknowledged that he had made choices that brought him into conflict with the law but resisted the broader characterization of himself as a predator. He spoke, briefly, of his family, of aging parents and younger relatives he would likely not see grow up if given a lengthy term. Whether out of pride, principle, or a calculated sense that admissions would not materially alter the outcome, he did not confess to participation in an organized enterprise, as the government had defined it. The sentence, when pronounced, was substantial. It reflected not only the counts of conviction, but also the broader context, his prior record, the perceived role he played, and the judge's view of the need to send a message about such conduct. To his family in the gallery, the numbers translated immediately into years of absence, birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days he would spend behind walls rather than at their tables. To law enforcement, the sentence marked the culmination of a long campaign to hold him accountable on a larger stage than the earlier gambling case had allowed. In the wake of sentencing, appeals were filed. His lawyers challenged aspects of the trial, the admission of certain wiretap evidence, the jury instructions on the enterprise element, the reliance on cooperators whose credibility, they argued, was too compromised to support conviction. Appellate courts, in turn, reviewed the record, weighed legal arguments, and issued opinions that, while often dense and technical, shaped how future cases would be tried. In Joseph's case, the higher courts upheld the core of the verdict. They found that, whatever imperfections might have existed in the lengthy proceedings, the evidence was sufficient under existing legal standards to sustain the key convictions. With appeals exhausted or narrowed, Joseph entered what would likely be the longest stretch of incarceration of his life. By then, he was no longer the young man who had first walked into a state prison on a gambling conviction, bewildered and angry. He was older, more worn, carrying the cumulative weight of years spent in the contested space between his neighborhood's informal economy and the formal apparatus of the state. Inside, he encountered another generation of inmates, some drawn into the system by similar paths, others caught up in newer forms of crime shaped by changes in technology and the drug trade. Outside, the world continued to shift. Neighborhoods like the one that had raised him underwent further waves of change. Rising property values in some areas, disinvestment in others, new immigrant communities layering their own histories over the old. The kind of traditional organized crime structure alleged in his case slowly lost ground, squeezed by law enforcement, competition from other criminal markets, and broader economic transformations. To younger observers, reading about his case in old newspaper clippings or criminal justice textbooks, Joseph seemed to belong to an earlier era, a link in a chain that had begun long before him, and that, by the time he was serving his racketeering sentence, was already fraying. Yet for those who knew him, and for the communities that had felt the impact of both his activities and the state's response, his story remained intensely personal. The legal and social conflicts that had defined his reputation, his clashes with law enforcement, his role in underground economies, his refusal to cooperate despite mounting pressure, were not abstractions. They were the stuff of family arguments, of late-night conversations in bars and living rooms, of differing views about what responsibility and betrayal meant in a world where opportunity and constraint had, for decades, been unevenly distributed. Behind the prison walls, Joseph carried that complicated legacy with him. His name had become shorthand, in some circles, for a certain kind of underworld persistence. In others, for the stubborn refusal to disengage from harmful activities even when given second chances. As he settled into the routines of long-term confinement, job assignments within the institution, limited recreations, the sparse pleasures of a visit or a letter, he lived out the consequences of choices and structures that had intertwined from his boyhood on stoops to his last day in the free world before the racketeering sentence began. The journey from neighborhood card games to a federal racketeering conviction was now complete, and the remaining chapters of his life would unfold largely within the confines of institutions built to contain the very social tensions his story embodied. The years of Joseph DiPalermo's long racketeering sentence unfolded less like chapters in a story than like layers of sediment, one day settling almost indistinguishably on top of another. Yet within that apparent monotony, his life continued to intersect with the broader forces, social, legal, and cultural, that had shaped it from the beginning. Prison did not freeze time. It merely compressed it, forcing him to watch changes that, on the street, he would once have tried to manage or exploit. By the time he resettled into the federal system for his racketeering term, Joseph was a middle-aged man. He had the look of someone who had spent much of his life under stress. The slightly stooped shoulders, the permanently alert eyes, the wary way of listening when someone new spoke. Intake officers already knew his name from the presentence report and the publicity around his case. To them, he was another organized crime defendant, neither a top-tier boss, whose movements would draw attention at the highest levels, nor a simple low-level street dealer. His file noted his prior conviction, his refusal to cooperate, and the judge's remarks about his role in an enterprise that had, in the court's view, damaged both individuals and the integrity of local commerce. He was assigned to a medium security facility, one of the many federal institutions that by the late 20th century held a mix of long-term offenders, drug traffickers serving lengthy sentences, white-collar criminals who had fallen from comfortable lives, men tied to various organized groups, and a shifting population of those in on shorter terms. Within that world, informal affiliations mattered. Inmates tended to cluster along lines of background, geography, and criminal history. Joseph, with his Italian surname and his case history, naturally gravitated toward others from similar milieus, men with stories about bookmaking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the fatting power of the traditional syndicates. For younger inmates, he represented a link to a version of organized crime they had mostly encountered through films, books, and the occasional news feature. They asked him questions, sometimes directly, sometimes obliquely, about the old days, about how gambling operations had run before the rise of legalized sports betting discussions and digital platforms, about what it meant to deal with bar owners and small-time bookmakers face to face. He was cautious in how he answered. He knew that loose talk could attract the attention of staff, that boasting would sit poorly with older prisoners who had seen the real costs of the life, and that his words could someday be repeated out of context. Still, over time, fragments of his experience seeped into the prison's informal oral history. He spoke of walking the same streets for decades and watching them change, of the uneasy coexistence between long-standing ethnic communities and the state, of his own progression from small-stakes games to larger operations, and finally, to the racketeering conviction that now defined him in official records. He did not glamorize these memories. Those who listened closely heard, behind the matter-of-fact descriptions, the toll it had taken, the lost years with family, the funerals he had missed, the aging parents now too frail to make the trip for visits. The children and nieces and nephews who had grown up mostly knowing him through bulletproof glass and supervised conversations. The institutional routines that had once seemed intolerable became, again, the scaffolding of his days. Morning counts, work assignments, meals, evening lockdown. Each framed a narrow zone in which he could exercise some control. He sought out work that kept his mind occupied, a job in the library if he could get it, or in maintenance where problem-solving and a measure of independence were possible. Staff evaluations from this period, written in terse bureaucratic language, generally describe him as compliant, not prone to trouble, wary of overt leadership roles among inmates but clearly influential in quieter ways. He was, by now, part of a cohort of men serving long sentences whose cases had drawn public attention in earlier decades, but who now moved through the institution with a kind of anonymity. New headlines focused on different kinds of crime, sprawling drug conspiracies, financial fraud on a massive scale, emerging forms of cybercrime. Organized crime had not disappeared, it never does, but it had changed shape. Younger offenders around him often came from drug markets that operated with a more volatile, decentralized logic than the gambling and loan-sharking structures of Joseph's formative years. Their stories featured turf wars more indiscriminate than the tight, often family-coded conflicts he had grown up hearing about. These differences sometimes led to quiet debates in the yard or dayroom, not about morality in the abstract, but about how and why things had changed. To older men from organized backgrounds, the new criminal economies looked chaotic and self-destructive, lacking the long horizon that had once guided syndicate decisions. To younger inmates, the older generation's talk of rules and lines that weren't crossed often sounded like nostalgia for a discipline that, in their experience, had rarely protected anyone at the bottom. Joseph listened more than he spoke in these exchanges, but when he did weigh in, it was usually to point out how the state itself had changed, how racketeering laws, asset forfeiture, and expanded surveillance had narrowed the space in which old-style organizations could operate. Even confined, he could track these developments. Newspapers, when he could get them, carried stories about new racketeering cases in cities he knew well. Legal news columns summarized Supreme Court decisions on sentencing, conspiracy law, and the rights of defendants. Occasionally, a documentary or news special on prison television would revisit the history of organized crime, sometimes glancing past his own case in a paragraph or two. He recognized names of former associates now portrayed as historical figures rather than current actors. Some had died, others were serving out their own long terms, a few had cooperated years earlier and disappeared into protection programs. Each name was a reminder of a world that had both shaped him and moved on without him. Family connections, always a fragile lifeline for long-term prisoners, frayed and held in uneven measure. His parents aged. One passed away during his sentence, an event he marked not with a funeral but with a short notification from the outside and a period of quiet in his cell. The institution might grant a brief furlough or escorted visit in some cases, but for a racketeering defendant with a record of deep underworld ties, such compassion was unlikely. Grief thus became something he had to manage within the boundaries of prison etiquette. A nod from other inmates, perhaps a handshake from a chaplain, then a return to routine. Younger relatives shouldered the burden of keeping contact alive. Some came regularly, others sporadically, their own lives constrained by work, childcare, and the logistical and emotional cost of prison visits. They brought news of the neighborhood, which blocks were now dotted with new condominiums, which old storefront churches had changed hands, how bars and social clubs he had once known as hubs of betting or loan collections were now cafes, laundromats, or simply boarded up. They told him of children excelling in school, of cousins moving to suburbs or entirely different states, chasing the very kinds of legitimate stability that had eluded his generation. Those visits were bittersweet. He was glad to hear that some of the younger generation were on different paths, college, trades, small businesses that stayed within the law. At the same time, their stories underscored the distance between his lived reality and the emerging future of his own family. He had become, in effect, a living cautionary tale and an object of complicated loyalty, the older relative whom some parents did not want their children to idolize, but whom they also did not want to abandon in his isolation. Inside, he developed a kind of custodial relationship to memory. Men who arrived at the institution later with fresh convictions for organized crime sometimes sought him out not as a commander or strategist, but as someone who understood how the law had changed, what investigators looked for, how prosecutors framed enterprise cases. He could not offer them a way out. He himself was living proof that the older unwritten rules, keep quiet, do your time, the life will take care of you, no longer held as they once had. But he could explain with a certain precision how patterns in phone records, bank deposits, and seemingly casual associations could take on legal meaning in the hands of determined investigators. This did not make him an advocate for cooperation. If anything, his own refusal to testify against others, even under intense pressure, had hardened into a core part of his identity. But he was not under any illusion that maintaining silence had worked, in any conventional sense. It had preserved his standing among a shrinking circle of underworld loyalists at the cost of years in prison and the erosion of his presence in his family's daily life. That trade-off, traced across decades, complicated any simplistic reading of him as either heroically loyal or stubbornly self-destructive. The prison system around him was not static. Policy shifts filtered down to the cell blocks. Tough-on-crime legislation passed in earlier years continued to exert influence, but there were also new conversations, among administrators, advocates, and occasionally legislators, about rehabilitation, reentry, and the astronomical costs of mass incarceration. Pilot programs appeared and disappeared. Reentry planning workshops, restorative justice circles, expanded educational offerings. Some institutions experimented with allowing older, long-term prisoners certain privileges if they stayed clear of discipline and mentored younger inmates. Joseph's participation in such efforts was, as before, cautious. He engaged enough to maintain good standing and perhaps to secure small improvements in his daily life. Educational or vocational programs might make the days move faster, might even provide skills useful if he were ever released at an age when work remained possible. But he did not reinvent himself as a poster subject for rehabilitation. The dissonance between program rhetoric, emphasizing bad choices, and better paths, and his own view of structural constraints and neighborhood realities was too great for that. Still, there were small changes in perspective. Time does that, especially when combined with age and the slowing of physical vitality. Men he had once viewed primarily as adversaries, detectives whose names had appeared in his case file, prosecutors who had argued for his incarceration, began to recede in his mental landscape as individuals. In their place, He saw the larger systems, the political pressures that shaped enforcement priorities, the public fears that fueled harsh sentencing, the institutional logics that made it easier to punish than to address underlying social conditions. This recognition did not absolve him of his own part in the story, but it did diffuse some of the personal animus that had colored his earlier years in custody. Academics and journalists, increasingly interested in the long tail of the 20th century crackdown on organized crime, occasionally reached out through official channels seeking interviews or comments. Some wanted to explore the human dimensions behind case captions and acronyms like RICO. Others hoped for insider color to enliven narratives about the mob in decline. Institutional rules about media access and his own temperament limited how much he engaged. He had seen over the years how stories could be selectively told, how nuance could be lost in the demands of accessible narrative. He was wary of becoming a character in someone else's script, a notorious mobster or a tragic figure, without control over the context. Yet his case inevitably appeared in broader analyses. Legal scholars cited it in discussions of how enterprise laws had been applied to mid-level figures, not just high-profile bosses. Criminologists looked at his trajectory as part of the careers of offenders who started in street-level operations and rose to positions that, while short of the mythic Don, nevertheless carried real power and risk. Social historians used his life as one data point in examining how post-war urban ethnic communities had produced both upwardly mobile professionals and deeply entrenched underworld figures, sometimes within the same extended families. As these narratives circulated outside, inside he did what men in long-term confinement have always done. He aged. The telltale signs crept in: stiffness in the mornings, slower reflexes, small health issues that, in the world outside, might have been addressed early but in prison often lingered before attracting serious attention. Medical visits and tests became more frequent. Institutional records began to classify him among the older inmate population, category that raised its own challenges for prison administrators, grappling with geriatric needs in facilities designed for young, physically volatile men. The question of whether he would live to see release shifted from abstract to immediate. Sentencing reforms and evolving policies on compassionate release for elderly or ill prisoners flickered at the edges of his world. Lawyers and advocates sometimes reviewed older cases to see if any relief might be available: sentence reductions, changes in guidelines, or, in rare instances, clemency. For someone like Joseph, with a serious racketeering conviction and a reputation embedded in law enforcement memory, such possibilities were limited, but they were not entirely absent. In some jurisdictions, there was growing recognition that incarcerating aging offenders well past their peak offending years offered diminishing returns for public safety. Even before any formal review, correctional culture around him reflected that shift. Staff in some units, faced with cell blocks containing men with gray hair and chronic conditions, altered their approach subtly, treating them less as potential rioters and more as institutional residents whose management required different tools. Younger inmates sometimes showed deference to older men who had put in time, even when they did not fully understand or approve of the lives that had led them there. Joseph, as an older organized crime figure, occupied a particular niche in that respect, neither revered nor reviled universally, but regarded as someone whose endurance commanded a measure of respect. As his racketeering term edged toward its later stages, the outside world changed again in ways that would have been almost unimaginable in his youth. Legalized gambling expanded. State lotteries became ubiquitous. Casinos spread beyond traditional hubs, and discussions about legal sports betting moved from the margins to mainstream policy debates. Activities that had once been the near-exclusive domain of men like Joseph were increasingly regulated, taxed, and marketed openly. News segments highlighted the economic impact of casino developments and the debate over online betting platforms, often with little reference to the underground economies that had preceded them. From his vantage point, this shift could only have appeared ironic. He had spent decades navigating, and ultimately being punished for, participation in gambling and debt economies that the state had now partly co-opted. The legal distinctions remained meaningful. He had not merely taken bets, but done so in conjunction with high-interest lending and under a regime of intimidation. But the broader moral fog around wagering and risk was unmistakably thicker than the stark legal lines of his indictment suggested. Whether this bred bitterness, resignation, or a quiet dark humor in him is hard to document with precision. The historical record here relies mostly on the recollections of those who spoke with him in his later years behind bars. What is clear is that by the time he approached the possibility of release, if he did at all, the city that had once been the entire stage of his working life was something else entirely. New waves of immigration, gentrification, economic restructuring, and legal change had altered not only its skyline but the social and criminal ecologies within it. The old social clubs that had once served as hubs of unofficial governance were, in many areas, gone or transformed. Younger offenders made their names, for better or worse, not by running numbers or collections for bookmakers, but by tapping into drug markets, cyber schemes, or entirely different illicit economies. In this context, Joseph's legacy began to harden into something closer to history than to current affairs. Law enforcement training materials reference cases like his as examples of successful enterprise prosecutions. Community advocates used his story, and others like it, to discuss the intertwined harms of organized crime and mass incarceration on urban neighborhoods. In some families, his name was invoked around dinner tables as a warning. A man who had been smart and capable and loved by many, but who had trusted a street system that ultimately returned loyalty with ruin. Inside, the weight of those narratives was less important than the next medical checkup, the next letter from home, the next small decision about how to spend an afternoon within the constraints of a fenced yard. He existed at the junction between being an active subject of law and media, and being, increasingly, a man whose most consequential choices lay in the past. The legal and social conflicts that had defined his reputation were now case law and cautionary tale, even as he continued to live their fallout in the most concrete way possible. Day by day, in a place built to make individuals interchangeable components of a larger system of control. As the end of his sentence, or the limit of his physical endurance, drew nearer, the central themes of his life, loyalty and law, opportunity and constraint, neighborhood and state, remained unresolved in any simple moral ledger. Those looking for a straightforward arc of redemption or a clear-cut portrait of villainy in his story would find neither. Instead, what emerged was something more uncomfortable and more instructive. The life of a man shaped by, and shaping in turn, the underworld structures of his era, brought again and again into collision with a legal system that evolved in response to men like him, and left in the end to reckon with the human cost of choices made in a world where the line between survival and harm was never as clear as statutes and headlines would later suggest. By the time the last phase of Joseph DiPalermo's life began, the world that had once given him both purpose and notoriety had largely receded into memory. The underworld structures he had served were weakened or scattered. The investigators who had spent their careers studying him were retired or reassigned. Younger officers and prosecutors knew his name mainly from old case files and training materials, an example tucked among many in thick binders about enterprise prosecutions. Outside the walls, city blocks he could have walked blindfolded in his youth were now unrecognizable, renovated, demolished, or reimagined for new populations with little awareness of the role his generation had played in the neighborhood's hidden economy. Whether through the natural expiration of his sentence, incremental reductions applied under revised guidelines, or age-related considerations that sometimes softened official attitudes toward long-imprisoned men, the fact is that the system's direct grip eventually loosened. For someone of his background and record, there were no grand announcements, no media countdown to his release. He came out, as countless others did, through paperwork and procedure, transfer to a halfway house or supervision program, issuance of clothes fit for the current season, a small packet of documents listing obligations and restrictions. To the institution, it was a routine event measured in forms and signatures. To him and his family, it was a moment that collapsed decades of separation into the single act of stepping back into the open air. The city he re-entered bore the faint outline of the one he had left, but not its substance. Old landmarks triggered immediate recognition: the church spire above tree lines, the curve of a particular avenue, the shape of a bridge against the sky. But their surroundings had changed almost beyond comprehension. Buildings that had once housed social clubs and backroom games now contained cafes, real estate offices, or sat subdivided into expensive apartments. Side streets that had been feared after dark were lit brightly and filled with young professionals walking dogs or pushing strollers. Languages on the street had shifted. Where he once heard mostly Italian and English laced with local slang, he now heard multiple languages from new immigrant communities and the flat, mobile accent of college-educated newcomers. He was, in effect, a historical figure walking through a future that had not been built with him in mind. The younger generation in his own extended family, many of whom had known him only through prison visits and stories, greeted his release with a mixture of relief, curiosity, and caution. They attended small gatherings in his honor, hugged him, listened to his observations about how tall they'd grown or how different the neighborhood looked, and then went back to lives structured around school schedules, regular jobs, and digital technology that rendered his old ways of operating archaic. Smartphones, online banking, legalized casinos, and soon, legal sports betting reshaped the terrain on which he had once moved with confidence. Legally, his freedom remained conditional. Supervised release terms, similar in spirit to parole, required him to report regularly to an officer, avoid contact with known criminals, abstain from illegal activity, and often from certain legal but risky activities such as entering casinos or bookmakers, now legal as well as illegal. For someone whose adult life had repeatedly tangled with law enforcement, these conditions were both familiar and newly constraining. The same rhythms that had structured his post-release period after his earlier prison stint resurfaced. Scheduled office visits, surprise home checks, questions about employment and associates. This time, however, there was a difference he could not ignore: age. In his younger years, supervision had been experienced as an obstacle to be managed while he quietly resumed old networks. Now, the very idea of going back to work in any illegal sense clashed with the realities of his body and of the changed world around him. The hours needed to reestablish a foothold, to rebuild trust with actors who had long ago filled his old roles, were hours he no longer had the energy or appetite for. The legal environment, too, had tightened further. Asset forfeiture laws were more robust, sentencing remained harsh for those with his record, and the capacity of law enforcement to monitor communications and financial transactions far outstripped what it had been even at the time of his racketeering conviction. In this context, his re-entry did not follow the familiar arc of a return to full-scale underground activity. Instead, it was characterized more by a gradual, sometimes halting, withdrawal into a narrower sphere of life. He lived modestly, often with or near family members willing to provide a room, meals, and the grounding presence of daily domestic routines. Work, when he could find it and when his health allowed, tended toward unglamorous, low-wage positions, helping in a relative's shop, doing light maintenance, occasionally advising someone informally on business matters in ways that stopped short of the old patterns of lending and collection. The people around him reacted to his presence in ways that reflected their own histories with the world he had left behind. Some older neighbors who remembered the era of backroom betting and envelope loans greeted him warmly, their conversations flickering briefly over shared memories before turning to grandchildren and medical appointments. Others kept their distance, remembering debts, arguments, or simply the fear that had once accompanied a knock on the door from men in his circle. Younger residents, with no direct recollection of his past, might have walked past him a dozen times without realizing that the quiet older man at the cafe had once been the subject of federal indictments and investigative files. Law enforcement did not entirely forget him, but their focus had shifted. The same kinds of task forces that had once tracked his movements now devoted more attention to other targets: multinational drug organizations, human trafficking operations, complex financial and cyber frauds. His name in active databases flagged him as a person of interest if some investigation brushed near his neighborhood, but he was no longer a priority. Periodic checks by supervision officers, the odd conversation with detectives who had read about him and were curious enough to ask a few respectful questions, remained reminders that his past could not simply be left behind. But the intensity that had once surrounded his every move was gone. These changes allowed space for another dimension of his life to emerge more clearly: his role within his own family as a figure of complicated instruction. Some younger relatives, particularly those who had grown up in the years when his case had already become a subject of media and legal commentary, wanted to understand not just what he had done, but why. They asked, sometimes hesitantly, about the early days, about how small hustles had turned into serious crimes, about whether he had ever thought of walking away at specific crossroads. His answers, by most accounts, were straightforward but never self-justifying. He acknowledged key decisions, pointed out pressures and limited options, and emphasized in unvarnished language the costs of the path he had chosen. In those conversations, the tension that had always run through his life, that interplay between structural forces and personal agency, came into focus. He did not pretend that poverty and discrimination alone had compelled him into the underworld. Many in his generation had faced similar hardship and chosen different routes. Nor did he concede to the comforting fiction that he had been merely a victim of overzealous law enforcement. He knew too well, from the testimony and evidence in his trials, how his actions had contributed to the burdens carried by borrowers and bettors who crossed his path. Yet he also knew that his story could not be fully understood without acknowledging the historical context. The post-war urban economy, the pattern of limited legitimate opportunities for young men like him, the long-standing presence of organized crime as an alternative structure of power and patronage. Outside his family circle, the debate over what men like him represented continued. Criminologists and historians increasingly looked back on the era of the great anti-organized crime campaigns with a more nuanced eye. Some emphasized the real damage inflicted by illegal gambling and loan sharking networks, particularly on already vulnerable communities. They pointed to families broken by debt, to small businesses that never recovered, to the way a climate of intimidation had undermined trust and civic engagement. Others highlighted the parallel harms of the state's response: lengthy mandatory sentences, the growth of prison populations, and the concentration of law enforcement resources in ways that sometimes left broader structural problems unaddressed. Joseph's case, already part of legal casebooks and analytic articles, was repeatedly mined for insights. Scholars noted that his life illustrated the capacity of enterprise statutes to reach beyond mythic crime bosses into the middle tiers of criminal organizations. They debated whether this was a necessary evolution or an overextension that risked blurring distinctions between degrees of culpability. Some saw his refusal to cooperate, even when it clearly came at a great personal cost, as evidence of a still powerful underworld code. Others read it as a tragic example of misplaced loyalty to institutions that had never truly served him in return. At a more local level, community activists sometimes invoked his story when talking about the intertwined legacies of organized crime and mass incarceration. In meetings about neighborhood redevelopment, youth programs, or criminal justice reform, his name might appear as shorthand. We don't want another Joey DiPalermo situation, where a kid with potential ends up feeding the system instead of escaping it, or as part of broader reflections about how to break cycles of underground economies and state repression. In these discussions, he became less an individual and more a symbol of choices made within constrained circumstances, of the long shadow those choices could cast, and of the need for institutions that offered real alternatives early enough to matter. For Joseph himself, living out his final years, these external debates were, at most, a distant echo. The daily realities he faced were more immediate, managing health problems that had been accelerated by age and years in custody, navigating the small indignities of decreased mobility, relying increasingly on others for transportation and assistance. In the waiting rooms of doctors' offices rather than courthouses, he sat among other elderly patients whose lives bore no resemblance to his, each of them now flattened by age into the shared experience of decline. As his generation thinned out, funerals became more frequent. He attended services for old friends, former associates, and sometimes adversaries, standing or sitting among mourners who carried their own private memories of what those men had been in their prime. At such gatherings, remnants of the old world surfaced, stories told in half-sentences, references to people and places unfamiliar to younger ears, a kind of gallows humor about the inevitability of the path they had followed. But even these were tempered by the knowledge that the structures that once bound them together had dissipated. They were, in a sense, veterans of a conflict that had ended without a clear victor, leaving behind only the enduring costs on all sides. Inevitably, his own health declined to the point where the bounds of the neighborhood, once the limits of his universe, grew too large to cross regularly. Home, whether an apartment of his own or a room in a relative's house, became the primary landscape of his days. The man who had spent his youth moving constantly between corners, back rooms, and street meetings now navigated shorter circuits, kitchen to chair, bedroom to window. Old habits lingered, listening closely to passing footsteps, noting who was on the street at what hour, but their practical function had mostly dissolved. In those quieter moments, the arc of his life could be seen most clearly, from a child in a crowded post-war apartment to a teenager drawn to corner games, from a young man making collections for others to a middle-aged defendant in a RICO trial, from an aging inmate explaining old cases to younger prisoners, to an old man whose history was now largely held in other people's files and memories. None of this resolved neatly into a simple moral at the end. He had been, undeniably, part of systems that profited from others' desperation and frailty. He had also been, just as undeniably, a product of historical circumstances that offered him a narrow set of paths and punished some of them far more visibly than others. When he finally died, whether at home, in a hospital, or, as sometimes happens with men who have spent most of their lives confined, back in an institution due to late-breaking complications, the event marked the end of a living link to a particular era of urban underworld life. Obituaries, where they appeared, were mostly brief. Some local papers noted that a one-time organized crime figure had passed, summarizing his case in a short paragraph drawn from archives. Law enforcement memorials occasionally mentioned his name as part of retrospectives on major prosecutions. For his family, the loss was more layered. Grief mingled with relief that his long struggle was over, pride in aspects of his character coexisting uneasily with the memory of harm done and time lost. In the years that followed, his story continued to circulate, though increasingly as second-hand recollection. A younger cousin might tell a friend, "My uncle was involved with the mob back in the day," and mentioned Joseph's name. A criminal justice seminar might assign a case study that included his trial. A documentary on the evolution of organized crime in American cities might devote a few minutes to his life as one example among many, illustrating how men from working-class ethnic enclaves found both opportunity and ruin in underground economies. The historical record, assembled from court transcripts, investigative files, news coverage, and interviews, preserves the outline of his life with a certain pitiless clarity. It shows a boy shaped by post-war urban poverty and informal power structures, a young man who chose, repeatedly, to deepen his involvement in illegal gambling and loan sharking, an adult who rose to a position of mid-level authority in an organized enterprise, and an older man who spent a substantial portion of his life behind bars, unwilling to cooperate even when that refusal extended his confinement. It also shows the state responding in ways that were sometimes necessary, sometimes excessive, always symptomatic of larger anxieties about crime, order, and social change. What it cannot fully capture are the internal textures of that life, the mix of fear, exhilaration, pride, and regret that, by all accounts, accompanied his journey. To neighbors who remembered him as both helper and threat, to family members who loved him and suffered for his choices, to law enforcement officers who saw him as both adversary and case study, he was never just a label or a line in a report. He was a person in whom larger tensions converged, the tension between loyalty to one's own and responsibility to the broader community, between informal economies and formal law, between the promise of the American city and the traps it laid for those on its margins. In the end, the life of Joseph DiPalermo stands as a window into that complex terrain. It neither excuses nor demonizes. Instead, it reveals how individual decisions and structural forces braided together to produce a career that was, in equal measure, a story of agency and entanglement. His rise as a notorious figure was not the product of a single dramatic turn, but of incremental steps taken in familiar streets, in rooms above bars, in whispered conversations that, at the time, seemed like the natural way of things. His eventual downfall, likewise, was not simply the victory of law over lawlessness, but the outcome of a long evolution in how the state confronted problems that had deep roots in the very social orders it had helped create. As history moves on, cases like his risk becoming flattened into cliches of mobster and crackdown. The fuller record resists that flattening. It shows how a man could be, at once, a product of immigrant striving and urban neglect, a participant in harm and a target of punishment regimes that raised their own moral questions. It reminds us that organized crime in his era was as much about the gaps in legitimate opportunity as it was about personal greed or appetite for power, and that efforts to combat it were as shaped by politics and public perception as by sober assessments of community well-being. Remembering the contours of his life, its early hopes, its illicit successes, its legal defeats, its long aftermath in prison and out, does not require sympathy or condemnation so much as attentiveness. In that attentiveness, one can see how the story of a single man from a single neighborhood illuminates wider truths about 20th century America, about the promises it made and broke, the underground systems it tolerated and then dismantled, and the human beings caught in between, whose lives were neither wholly self-authored nor entirely predetermined. Joseph DiPalermo lived and died in that in-between space, and it is there, in the tensions he embodied, that the lasting meaning of his story resides.